So I like wrapping up Chapter 9 with a brief discussion about how muscles go about making ATP. So we've seen that ATP is very important for muscle function, but we haven't yet discussed how muscles go about creating it and acquiring it. So that'll be the focus of this final segment for Chapter 9 here. Okay. So let's review just very briefly how muscles actually go about using ATP before we get kind of back into the details of how they go about making it. So remember that ATP is really important in the cross-bridge cycle and sort of in two steps of the cross-bridge cycle. So ATP binding to myosin helps to actually break the myosin-actin cross-bridge after the power stroke has occurred. So it essentially helps in detachment, right? And then the myosin, once ATP is bound, will hydrolyze ATP, essentially splitting a phosphate off of it, releasing chemical energy to return myosin to its high energy configuration, or its kind of spring-loaded configuration as I described it. So that's how the sarcomere and really how myosin uses ATP, but in general muscles use ATP also to power the sodium-potassium pump. So remember, that's a form of active transport, and so it requires chemical energy. And in this case, the sodium-potassium pump is going to be involved in maintaining that very important resting membrane voltage or resting membrane potential that we saw that allows action potentials to occur in skeletal muscles. Okay, so we've seen how muscles use ATP. Now we'll take a look at how muscles actually make ATP. Okay, so hopefully I've made the case that ATP is very important in the proper physiological function of skeletal muscles. Okay. But muscles don't store ATP. That is, muscles don't have this huge sort of bank or storage of ATP. So essentially that means they're going to make it as they need it. Muscles only have enough ATP stored for about 6 seconds worth of intense activity before they have to make more of it, right? So then they have to create more of it. So what we're going to look at here is we're going to look at 3 overall mechanisms of how muscle cells go about producing ATP. And really all of these mechanisms simply involve transferring chemical energy from one substance to the other. And that is, they're going to be transferring chemical energy from one substance to ATP. All right. So our 3 mechanisms that we're going to investigate here. The first one is called direct synthesis or direct ATP synthesis. Basically, this is a kind of short-term method for making ATP. That is, the muscle stores a very specific substance that's involved in direct synthesis, and once that substance has been used up, it has to switch to other mechanisms to making ATP. So this is a good mechanism for creating ATP for a brief time, particularly during intense activity. Our muscles can also make ATP in the absence of oxygen, and again, this is also a good short-term ATP production mechanism, and this is usually used also during very intense exercise. In this particular mechanism, or in this particular pathway for making ATP, it uses glucose, but the yield of ATP for each glucose going into it is very low. And finally, we're going to take a look at the mechanism that makes most of the ATP for our muscles, and that is where ATP is made in the presence of oxygen. This is, as I mentioned, is going to make most of the ATP for our muscles, and it also uses glucose, but it has a much higher yield than making ATP in the absence of oxygen. So the first of these mechanisms that we'll take a look at is direct synthesis or direct ATP synthesis. And muscles make use of this substance that they store in very small quantities. That's called creatine phosphate. So basically what happens is the muscle cell will use an enzyme to transfer chemical energy from creatine phosphate to make ATP. Okay. So the cell only stores very small quantities of creatine phosphate, or CP. It stores enough for about 15 seconds worth of ATP production in high intensity exercise here. And so what you're seeing here is just kind of a basic diagram from the textbook that outlines just how this process of direct synthesis or direct ATP synthesis works here. Okay. So it takes this substance, creatine phosphate, and it uses an enzyme called creatine kinase. And creatine kinase, what it does is it simply chops a phosphate group off of creatine phosphate and moves it to ADP, or adenosine diphosphate. So it's transferring a phosphate group from creatine phosphate to ADP. In the process, it's making, and so when it does that, the result is ATP. So if we add one phosphate group to adenosine diphosphate, we will get adenosine triphosphate, or ATP. And then we're left with creatine, which can later have a phosphate group added back to it. So kind of a little biology shorthand here that I wanted to give you before we leave this idea. So this word here this term here, kinase, is a very important term, particularly because the suffix ase denotes an enzyme. So typically enzymes in biological systems have this ase suffix at the end of it. And a kinase is always going to be an enzyme, or it refers to a specific type of enzyme that transfers phosphate groups from one substance to another. Okay. And so the yield of this is pretty direct, pretty straightforward. That is, for each creatine phosphate that is invested, we get a yield of 1 ATP. Okay, so pretty straightforward. So recall that I mentioned that if we have an ADP that is an adenosine diphosphate, and we add a phosphate group back to it, we get ATP. So recall that when ATP is used up, what happens is that we remove or we chop off one of the phosphate groups, and that results in a molecule called ADP, the phosphate group that was removed, and the energy that resulted from the breaking of that chemical bond there. So ADP comes from the ATP that had a phosphate group removed. So really what direct synthesis is doing is it's just sticking this phosphate back onto ADP to make ATP. Okay, so that does it for a direct synthesis. So now let's turn our attention to making ATP when oxygen is not particularly available in the muscle. And we'll talk about when and why it might not be particularly abundant in the muscle at that time. We'll get to that in just a second. So the formal name for this, making ATP in the absence of oxygen, is called anaerobic glycolysis. And so this is a process that uses glucose. So this term glycolysis should be familiar, right? Sugar splitting is what it's doing. And this term anaerobic is simply referring to the fact that it's done without oxygen. Anaerobic means no oxygen or very low oxygen. So we're splitting glucose without a lot of oxygen present. Okay. Where this occurs is it occurs in the cytosol, or the sarcoplasm of our muscle cells. As I've already mentioned, it requires glucose. It requires that glucose is the molecule that's storing chemical energy, and essentially what the body does is it's transferring chemical energy from glucose to ATP to make ATP. So essentially what happens is that when the glucose is brought into the cytosol of the cell, the glucose is split. That is, there's a chemical reaction that occurs. I don't particularly care that you know the steps in that chemical reaction. I just want you to know the outcome of that chemical reaction is that glucose is essentially fed into this process called glycolysis, this series of chemical reactions called glycolysis. And what happens at the end of that chemical reaction is that glucose is split, and it's split into two molecules of what are called pyruvic acid. Okay. I should note too that glycolysis never requires oxygen, even if oxygen is available in this particular system. It still doesn't need oxygen to split glucose into pyruvic acid. Okay, so even when it's available, it doesn't need it. So if oxygen is not present after our pyruvic acid is formed, the body will turn pyruvic acid into this other substance called lactic acid, and lactic acid is essentially a waste product, so the body has to later get rid of lactic acid. The yield for this is a little bit better than we saw in direct ATP synthesis, in that we get 2 ATP for each glucose that is being invested into this process. So I mentioned that oxygen availability at certain times during muscle activity might be low. So why is that? So consider a situation in which the muscle is contracting extremely forcefully. And when muscles contract really forcefully, blood vessels in the muscle that is contracting might become constricted. That is, the blood flow through those blood vessels is going to drop as a result of the high production in muscle force. And so what this is going to do is it's going to cut off oxygen delivery to muscles. And so oxygen delivery is going to be very significantly reduced. And one thing that I haven't really mentioned, or one thing that I haven't really discussed, is kind of where the body gets glucose, right, for this process, because glucose is the chemical energy or the chemical substance that's going into this chemical reaction. So where is it coming from ultimately, right? So obviously glucose comes from the food that we ingest, so it is absorbed through the intestines and into the blood, and through the blood it is delivered to our muscles. But animals can also store unused glucose. That is, if glucose in our blood goes unused after a meal, what we can do is we can actually store glucose for use later on, that is, for use between meals and things like that. And we store it as this long chain of glucose that's referred to as glycogen. So we have a glucose here. It's I don't particularly care that you know the chemical structure of it, but it's a 6-carbon ring structure. And glycogen is simply a chain or a series of chains of glucose, as you can see here. And where our body primarily stores glycogen is not only in the muscles but in the liver. And essentially when we need some glucose, and glucose is not particularly abundant in the blood, our body can simply remove glucose molecules from these long chains of glycogen. Okay, so that's where our body can get glucose. So one question that might seem kind of strange and kind of silly, but I think it's worth answering anyway, is that I've just shown you that we can make ATP without oxygen. So why do we need to breathe in the first place? That is, why do we need oxygen all the time when I just showed you that we don't? There are certain instances when we don't need oxygen to make ATP. I mentioned that one of the waste products that's created at the end of glycolysis is called lactic acid, and this substance has to be eliminated from the body. That is, this stuff doesn't just go away. It's the body actually has to do work. That is, it has to invest some energy in getting rid of this substance here. So essentially what the body can do is convert that lactic acid back into pyruvic acid, and when it has pyruvic acid, we can convert pyruvic acid back into glucose. Okay, so essentially we can essentially kind of do the opposite reaction of glycolysis. We can put glucose back together. And the liver is the main organ in the body that does this conversion. And in order to do this, it requires oxygen. So in order to eliminate lactic acid later on, we need oxygen. Okay. So it's kind of useful or kind of helpful to think of glycolysis like a credit card, right? So credit card, you can buy something now and you can pay it back later, right? So glycolysis is kind of the same way. Glycolysis, you can make some ATP without oxygen now, but later on your body says, or your body requires you to kind of repay the oxygen that you didn't use when you made ATP during glycolysis. So essentially, you can make energy without oxygen for a little bit, but your body wants you to kind of pay that oxygen back in some way, right? So oxygen is required later to eliminate lactic acid and things like that. And so this phenomenon, or this process, is called EPOC, which is called excess post-exercise oxygen consumption. I know that's a big long term. It used to be formally known as the oxygen debt, but they've gone kind of with this newer nomenclature here. But basically this just means that we can make energy now, but without some oxygen, but later on we need, our body needs to essentially repay the oxygen that we didn't use during that process here. And so to kind of think about this process, right, think about going for a jog or a run, or doing some strenuous exercise for a brief time, right? Your breathing rate is going to increase in order to keep up with demand that your body's using, right? So your muscles are going to be using a lot of oxygen to make ATP when your activity rates increase. So your breathing rate's going to increase in response to that, to keep up with demand for oxygen, right? But imagine after that brief bout of intense exercise that you immediately stop, right? So you immediately cease doing that particular activity. Does your breathing rate immediately go back to your resting breathing rate? And the answer to that is no, right? So we all have had this experience before. So that is the EPOC, or excess post-exercise oxygen consumption. So your breathing rate, even after you stop exercising, continues to be at an elevated rate for a few minutes, right? So essentially, as I kind of gave you this analogy of the oxygen debt and glycolysis kind of being like a credit card, there's a debt of oxygen that has to be paid back in order to convert lactic acid back to glucose, right? Okay, so finally we can now discuss making ATP in the presence of oxygen, and the formal name for this process is called aerobic cellular respiration. It looks a little bit more complicated. We won't go through all these steps, but I'll kind of give you the basic overview of it here. This process occurs in the mitochondria of our cells, and so this is the organelle that's going to be taking the glucose that our body or that our cells take up, and it's going to be taking oxygen and using that in a series of chemical reactions in order to make lots of ATP. Right? So the beginning, or these substances feeding into aerobic cellular respiration are the substances that are created during glycolysis. So glycolysis has to occur first. So we get glucose, that is, glucose comes into the cytosol, or the sarcoplasm of our skeletal muscles. It is split into pyruvic acid, so and remember that step does not require oxygen, even if oxygen is available. So oxygen is not necessary to break down glucose into pyruvic acid. Okay, so glucose is split or converted into pyruvic acid, and as I mentioned, this doesn't require oxygen, even when it's available. And so what our mitochondria then do after glycolysis has occurred is they take the pyruvic acid and they take the oxygen, and they use this to make a lot of ATP out of those two substances. Okay. A couple of the byproducts that are spit out as a result of this reaction are water, which is not a terrible byproduct. We can always use a little bit more water, right? And another byproduct that's created is CO2, or carbon dioxide. And this is simply eliminated when it enters the blood and we exhale it through our lungs and our respiratory system. Okay, and the ATP yield in this chemical reaction in aerobic respiration is quite high. So for each one glucose that's invested, we get a yield of 32 ATP.